We are less than 2 months from the 2022 midterm battles and election days, formally in November. And there's a fascinating, intriguing get out the vote operation which is underway. It is led by Linh Nguyen. She is a senior advisor with the Asian American organization Run AAPI. And Linh joins us now. Linh, first of all, tell me why put this together?
David, well, one, thank you for having me. Two, thank you for us having this space to talk about the power of the Asian American vote. I mean, I think that's pretty much it. David, we have a little under 8 weeks before midterm elections are here. And yet every single year we are scrambling to understand who are Asian Americans, where do they vote, how do they vote? And here we are all over again. And yet we claim this as, the fastest growing racial demographic across the country. And yet we are still seeing this push to understand who they are. So this is a sprint to November all over again.
And as our Chiron says, it's called Give a F rhymes with duck about midterms. Is it just to sort of grab attention to use that? Is it trying to go for a younger audience? What's the appeal there?
I mean, I think y'all can piece it together. I mean, give an F about midterms. We are clearly trying to connect with young voters. If anyone Googles young voters and Democrats today, I mean, everyone is in a mad rush to understand, how do we court them? Are we making sure they're getting to the polls? Young people can absolutely be saving the Democratic Party at this time. And yet we're kind of seeing the traditional engagement tactics all over again, right? And so for us, our whole thinking is that, one, young voters are absolutely going to be voting this year in 2022. Secondly, young Asian voters are such a fast growing demographic, and yet why aren't we investing as much into this community as we are with others?
Yeah, I think I read that over the past 20 years, the Asian American community has literally doubled the number of eligible voters in the United States.
That's exactly it. I mean, and I think that the challenge here, David, is that, even though this community is growing, not only in political influence, but that, there are some states where if you do a breakdown of their voting electorate, you might have 5, 6, maybe 7% of Asian American voters comprising of the entire voting map. But when it comes to midterm elections, we know this. Some of these elections can come down to the hundreds of voters where every single vote is going to count. And I'm here in Texas. There is a huge population here in Houston. All along the southern states, we are growing in size and in political influence, especially in Georgia. And so our biggest urge right now is that we have to continue this outreach, and just you can't forget about Asian Americans, again, as Americans and our political identity.
What are the main issues that seem to resonate with Asian Americans? And is it that different from everybody else?
Oh, that's okay. Good question. And David, I appreciate you asking that second piece, because that is something that we have been screaming in the void when it comes to explaining that Asian American Pacific Islander voters, they are just as diverse, they are just as vibrant and multi-dimensional as any other voter. We did quite a bit of polling and case studies specifically with young Asian American voters across the country. Economy, healthcare, education, immigration, all of these top issues. And of course, and I think we all know this, but the current issue on abortion rights, that is at the top of mind. And you're right. So to your point, it's Asian American voters are just like every other voter. We care on such a unique range of issues. But again, we are just asking for more love.
Because of, I suppose, a culture and sort of heritage where a lot of Asian Americans come from, or their families have come from places where there's, a really big value on sort of a disciplined society, so to speak. It seems like there's perhaps maybe more Asian Americans who might sort of lean towards Republicans and say Latinos. Is that fair?
David, I've heard that sentiment so many times, and it just, I promise y'all, head to any major city, talk to any at least young Asian voter. I think the greatest stereotype that we're having to fight is that, one, a lot of Asian Americans under the age of 50 are a lot more left-leaning in ideology than I think a lot of folks understand. And I think, one, there is this multi-generational divide, and you're absolutely right. And I think of my own parents, I'm Vietnamese. We couldn't talk about politics. Even today, we can't talk about politics, but things are changing. And I think the greatest opportunity, and specifically for, again, our Democrats on the ballot this year, is that if you're not taking that effort to understand who young Asian Americans are today, that is one of the greatest missed opportunities for midterms.
And how do you see the candidates doing in terms of understanding? Are they doing a very good job of trying to reach out to the Asian American community? Are they trying to understand their issues? Or, I mean, as we've seen with other groups, sometimes politicians, particularly those who are not very savvy, just sort of take a lot of folks for granted.
Right. I think it's, like I said, y'all, we have roughly 8 or so weeks before election days here. Even in a state like Texas, where, again, we have amazing candidates on the ballot, you're running against limited resources, limited time, and honestly, limited money. And when you don't have the resources, you're not reaching the right people. And so I think it's, sadly, I think what I'm seeing is that there are a lot of candidates that are leaving it to this very last push, in the last few weeks during the get out the vote phase for candidates, where, oh my gosh, like we got to hit up the Asian boba shops, or we got to make sure that we are phone banking and canvassing in 12 different languages. And what we see year after year is these efforts come a little bit too late. And so I do hope it's changing this year. It's really hard to tell at this time.
Do you see you mentioned Texas, do you see any particular states, particular races where the Asian American community could make a significant difference?
I'm going to say, y'all, it's going to be Georgia again. It is. And like, historically, we saw this in 2020. We saw it again in 2021 during the U.S. Senate runoffs. But there were so many different pockets. And this is not just in Atlanta, but in the suburbs of Atlanta that made the defining difference, specifically in Georgia, Congressional District 7. I think when we talk of that margin of victory, when it comes down to those hundreds of voters, if you are investing in that AAPI community, that could make a defining difference, whether you win or you lose. But I want to urge people to be watching and investing in Georgia as well.
And in Georgia, it seems like those spa shootings were a galvanizing sort of issue. Is it still sort of galvanizing the Asian American community now, a couple of years later?
Right. That's a very, very good point, David. I mean, we deeply felt this during the pandemic and the rise in anti-Asian violence, the rhetoric, the xenophobia. And I think the key piece here is that we felt that it did impact the community deeply in a number of cultural ways. I think what's going to be left for political candidates to understand is that, like, how do we connect the dots and ensuring that, one, we see Asian Americans as who they are, belonging in this country, and secondly, when it comes to electing them in the office, then what happens, right? We want that accountability piece. We want y'all to still continue engaging with us even after casting our ballot.
One of the greatest fears that I think it's whether it's, the Jewish community, the African American community, Latino community, the Asian American community, is simply sort of violence, just sort of the raw racism, hatred that seems to exist in far too many places across the United States. What, if anything, can an elected lawmaker at the federal level do about trying to curb that sort of violence, trying to make things perhaps easier for these communities?
Yeah, I mean, David, we kind of saw this a little bit. I think this was last year when the bill on the anti-Asian hate crimes bill had passed. And I think one thing, and this was something, a table that we were invited to, but when you engage and you bring in community advocates and you ask them, how do we reimagine your safety? What does this look like in New York City? What does it look like in Southern California? But how is it different here in Houston or Dallas or in Atlanta? But I think to your question, I would very much urge a lot of our elected officials to not only take into consideration what our lived experiences are like, specifically us feeling for our own safety, but inviting us to the table to help draft what this bill is going to look like. That is going to be a key piece.
And in terms of how the Asian American community votes, I mean, there's some predictability in terms of how Jewish voters, whether they show up on election day or cast early ballots. It's the same with heavily African American precincts. Is there a stereotypical way that Asian Americans tend to vote, and is there an effort to change that?
Oh, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One, I think there isn't enough data. I mean, we talk on these, post-election day, exit polling, what are the numbers telling us? And oftentimes that data isn't desegregated so that we can understand that, okay, when we look at these different precincts, what is the breakdown of actual AAPI voters? And that's been a very recent thing in 2020. I remember specifically we need to improve on understanding how to do these demographic breakdowns more specifically so that, yes, we can provide an accurate analysis of how they are voting and where they are voting. But I will say again, I think Georgia in 2020 and 2021 just proved to us that we are surge voters. We are part of the margin of victory. And I think all along these states where, again, we're not just in California and New York City, we will definitely turn out in numbers. And I say that in very certain ways.
And if this turnout does happen, if there is an Asian American surge and it, supports Democrats, a lot of people are going to think, okay, well, are these more centrist Democratic policies? Are they more progressive Democratic policies? What is it that the Asian American community in general is looking for?
I think one, and we hear this a lot, David, and I can absolutely see other communities of color fighting for this. But one, we're asking for better representation, right? And there's one piece in seeing us and seeing folks who identify as Asian Americans representing us in office. But I think the other side to this, and we hear this a lot, specifically with young Asian American voters, they need people who know how to champion for their issues, right? It is not, and I will say this again, but it is not enough to simply identify and run on your race. It is not enough. And so I think for us, when we see voter turnout within our own communities, our issues are heard. But we also we get a chance to have a seat at the table. We talk about this Democratic table often, but often we're not included there.
And our young Asian Americans, are they excited by this campaign? What's been the reaction?
I'm going to be honest, David, and I think if you ask anyone across this country, I mean, we're taking our time talking to young Asians and like very clearly asking them, do you give an F about midterms? It's a whole range of different responses. People are either letting us know, wow, I actually didn't know there was an election coming up. Others who are very, very excited. And I think others that are just driven by, like I see what's happening in SCOTUS. I see that my complete rights have been taken away. So it's been a range of different reactions. And I think to us, that's telling. I mean, we have to keep doing this work.
Yeah, and good for you for doing the work and trying to break through. Linh Nguyen, she is the senior advisor of the Asian American organization Run AAPI. Lynn, good luck to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David.